On the freezing, pitch-black night of May 17, 1876, the standard-gauge steel rails of the Great Northern Railway line outside Huntingdon, England, began to hum with a low, violent vibration. Slicing through the thick British mist at 50 miles per hour came the Flying Scotsman, the crown jewel of the British industrial empire, carrying thousands of pounds in untraceable gold bullion, high-value banknotes, and elite high society mail packets. The local railway authorities were entirely confident. They believed the express was an unassailable rolling fortress, physically impossible to breach while in motion. But they had calculated their security parameters using local, predictable criminal behavior. They were completely unprepared for the arrival of an entirely different breed of predator. Hiding in the shadows of a desolate trackside switching house stood a highly organized cell of American outlaws. These men were veterans of the brutal, high-speed train robberies that plagued the transcontinental rail lines of the American Wild West. Men who viewed the polite, unmonitored security protocols of the British railway system not as a barrier, but as an open invitation. With mechanical precision, they didn't just ambush the train. They systematically hijacked the entire industrial line, leaving Victorian detectives running around in circles searching for phantoms. If you demand true crime documentaries that dissect the sharp structural friction between criminal intelligence and forensic evolution, without the lazy, slow-paced biographical lectures, consider subscribing to Enter the Crime. Because the true mystery of the 1876 express robbery isn't how these international outlaws managed to strip the train vault bare in total silence. It's how they exposed a catastrophic structural blind spot that modern cybercriminals are still actively exploiting to hijack global supply chains today. To examine the structural anatomy of the Great Train Robbery of 1876, we must look beyond the romanticism of the Victorian steam era and confront the significant logistical vulnerabilities of its infrastructure. In the late 19th century, Great Britain was a hyper-centralized industrial powerhouse, entirely dependent on the extensive railway networks that served as its steel arteries. Daily, millions of pounds in physical wealth moved across the countryside, entirely unprotected and secured by nothing more than simple iron padlocks and the societal assumption of law and order. For those familiar with modern contexts, this environment operated much like the early, unmonitored digital networks of the late 1990s. The system was designed solely for speed and industrial efficiency, lacking any structural security measures to defend against a calculated, asymmetric threat. Enter the operational masterminds behind the scheme, a highly disciplined international group of American outlaws led by a career criminal and intelligence analyst known in the underworld as Chicago Bill McCarty. Having spent a decade studying the crude, violent methods of the James Younger gang across the plains of Missouri and Kansas, McCarty realized a critical evolutionary fact that overlooked by his American contemporaries. There was no need to ride horseback, wave pistols, or blow up train cars with dynamite if the local infrastructure was built on absolute, unverified trust. In early 1876, McCarty traveled from New York to London under a sophisticated, wealthy alias and established a network of upper-class business fronts. He spent months riding the Great Northern Railway as a first-class passenger, meticulously cataloging the guards' routines, the baggage handlers' timing, and the precise points where trains had to slow to navigate sharp rural bends. During these scouting missions, McCarty discovered the system's fatal flaw. Once the Flying Scotsman cleared London's city limits, it entered a London's communicat. In 1876, trains had no real-time wireless communication, and trackside stations had no means of communicating. Also, yards inside the baggage van would be completely isolated from the rest of the world. McCarty's operational understanding was psychologically astute. He realized that if his team could infiltrate the moving express without triggering the external emergency brake cords, they could execute a massive, manual vault extraction over a 50-mile stretch of track. Local law enforcement wouldn't even be aware that a crime had been committed until the train arrived at its next major destination station hours later. The outlaws didn't simply devise a plan to rob a train. They created an operational blueprint designed to exploit the physical lag time inherent in Victorian civilization. They understood that local police were trained to look for chaotic street criminals and had no defensive protocols in place to counter an organized, internationalating with precision. The stage was set, the blind spot was confirmed, and the countdown to the Huntingdon ambush had officially begun. The time was exactly 9:45 p.m. on May 17, 1876, when the Flying Scotsman pulled out of London's King's Cross Station, its heavy iron wheels grinding against the wet steel track. Inside the locked baggage car, 2 veteran guards managed the security vault, which contained 3 massive iron safes packed with gold bullion destined for banking houses in the north. The guards checked the heavy brass padlocks, confident the reinforced oak doors kept everything secure. What they did not realize was that the breach had already occurred from within. 2 blocks down the train, sitting comfortably in a luxury first-class carriage, were Bill McCarty and his primary lock-breaker, an American outlaw known as Philadelphia Harry Williams. They wore no visible insignia and carried no arms. Instead, they dressed as wealthy industrialists, blending seamlessly into high society. As the express cleared the London suburbs and reached its maximum cruising speed of 50 miles per hour, the roar of the engine and the violent rattling of the carriages created a deafening acoustic barrier. McCarty stood up, stepped into the narrow, unlit connecting corridor and signaled to Williams. In 1876, British train carriages did not feature enclosed, weatherproof corridors. To move from a passenger car to the rear baggage van while traveling at high speed, the outlaws had to execute a dangerous physical stunt, stepping outside onto a narrow 6-inch iron footplate and clinging to external brass handrails while the wind threatened to tear them from the side of the train. A single slip could mean instant death under the crushing steel wheels. Navigating the exterior of 3 moving carriages in complete darkness, the outlaws reached the baggage van door. Williams pulled out a set of custom-made, duplicate steel skeleton keys that he had spent weeks bribing a low-level foundry worker in London to acquire. He slipped the key into the lock. It turned with a dull, heavy click, completely masked by the thunderous roar of the steam engine. The outlaws stepped inside the vault car, and before the 2 guards could even turn their heads, they were staring down the cold steel barrels of 2 American-made Colt revolvers. For 45 minutes, while the train sped through the dark countryside past Huntingdon, Williams manually defeated the internal lock mechanisms of all 3 safes. He extracted the gold bricks and bundles of banknotes, transferring them into heavy canvas sacks. At exactly 10:40 p.m., the train hit a pre-planned rural incline, forcing the engineer to throttle back the speed to 20 miles per hour. McCarty opened the side cargo doors, letting the cold air rush in. They hurled the canvas sacks out into the dark brush, where 2 accomplice outlaws were waiting with a horse-drawn wagon. McCarty and Williams then untied the guards just enough to allow them to break free 10 minutes later, slip back out the door, crawl along the external footplates, and return to their first-class seats before the train reached its next stop. When the Flying Scotsman finally rolled into the terminal, the guards sounded the alarm. However, local police faced an immediate and absolute historical bottleneck. In was 6, to Crimwace Forensics and crime scene and no blood typing. The outlaws had walked off the train as gentlemen, leaving behind 0 physical clues. Local law enforcement was left staring at empty safes and an unmapped, pitch-black rail line. And that's when the real nightmare began. The Victorian detective inspector assigned to the case walks into the empty baggage van on the morning of May 18. He finds himself trapped in an investigative thriller where every clue leads to a dead end. Detectives thought they had the men almost immediately. They detained 3 local railway laborers who had been spotted drinking near the Huntingdon tracks on the night of the robbery. They interrogated them for 48 hours. They didn't have them. The laborers were simple locals. They lacked the engineering intelligence required to duplicate a master key or navigate a moving train carriage. The lead evaporated. The task force shifted their focus to the financial trail, trying to track the stolen banknotes as they entered circulation in London. But the outlaws had already laundered the currency through a complex network of international gold brokers who asked zero questions. Every time the police moved, they found themselves chasing paper phantoms. The Victorian investigation hit a brick wall for one fundamental reason. The technology of 1,871,876 would not bridge gap between physical evidence and human identity. But let us strip away the historical lag time. Let us activate the forensic mirror and drop this exact 1876 crime scene into a 2026 state-of-the-art investigative laboratory. If Bill McCarty and his cell executed this exact operation today, they would not make it past the county line. The moment the vault breach was detected, modern forensic technicians treat the entire train carriage as a living map of biological data. First, investigators would completely ignore the clean and look directly at the iron, focusing on vault door handles. Williams had to touch the cold steel lock face with his bare fingers to feel the lock pins drop. In 1876, that detail meant nothing. In 2026, technicians would use an M-Vac wet vacuum system. This device sprays a sterile solution onto porous or flat surfaces while simultaneously vacuuming it back up, extracting microscopic, deep-seated skin cells that standard swabs leave behind. Those trace cells would yield a full DNA profile within hours. That DNA profile would immediately be pushed into investigative genetic genealogy IG platforms. Modern forensic genealogists don't need a suspect's pre-existing criminal record. They upload the DNA to public databases, cross-reference it with millions of ancestral profiles, and map out the suspect's third or fourth cousins. Within a fourth cousin family tree, they could narrow down the identity of Philadelphia Harry Williams to his exact birth certificate. Next, look at the outlaw's primary alibi, that it was physically impossible to drop canvas gold sacks from a moving train without them splitting open or destroying the evidence. McCarty relied on the dark, unmapped rural landscape to conceal the drop zone. Today, forensic units would fly a drone equipped with LiDAR spatial scanning over the Huntingdon line. LiDAR fires millions of laser pulses per second, cutting through heavy forest canopies and foliage to create a highly precise, millimeter-accurate 3D digital twin of the terrain. Physicists would run a projectile trajectory simulation inside the digital twin software, factoring in the train's speed, the weight of the gold, and the gravity drop. The software would pinpoint the exact square meter where the sacks landed, matching tire tread indentations. McCarty would then get the getaway wagon to the steamer ship to New York under a fake name, erasing his digital footprint because no such footprint existed. In 2026, an international flight or sea voyage leaves an unerasable trail of digital breadcrumbs. Investigators would immediately pull a cellular tower dump from every tower along the Huntingdon rail line during that 45-minute window. Even if the outlaws used encrypted burners, their devices would perform a continuous digital handshake with the local masts as the train passed. Analysts would run an anomaly detection algorithm to isolate any mobile devices that moved along the tracks at precisely 50 miles per hour. Cross-referencing those device IDs with automatic license plate readers at the Huntingdon stations and real-time bank ledger monitoring would expose McCarty's entire financial structure before his ship ever cleared British waters. Let's pause the narrative for a crucial community engagement question. Looking at this physical evidence through our modern lens, do you think an outlaw like Bill McCarty would have survived an hour against 2026 telecommunications tracking? Or did the severe limitations of the 1876 Victorian policing system simply make these street-level criminals look like criminal masterminds? Take a moment to leave your thoughts in the comments section below. We analyze every single response. But as you type your perspective, remember this uncomfortable truth. McCarty didn't outsmart the detectives. He simply exploited a world that moved slower than his ambition. The Victorian detectives were left chasing ghosts across an unmonitored empire, entirely blind to the fact that while they were analyzing footmarks in the mud, the stolen gold was already being melted down inside a private refinery 300 miles away. To completely map out the anatomy of the 1876 raid, we must dissect the internal criminal psychology of the men who pulled the triggers and the rigid class psychology of the victims they targeted. But while Victorian investigators analyzed his escape patterns, a hidden piece of evidence was about to surface via transatlantic intelligence records that changed everything they thought they knew about Bill McCarty's behavioral loop. When international detectives finally cross-referenced New York transit files, they discovered that McCarty wasn't an impulsive thief. He was a classic power-assertive organizer. He suffered from an absolute hubris, a psychological condition common among high-stakes fraudsters who view society's rules as a challenge, meant to be solved by superior intellect. McCarty did not view the Flying Scotsman as a train. He viewed it as a slow, predictable machine operated by a culture obsessed with politeness and status. He deliberately weaponized his upper-class American disguise, knowing that Victorian station masters would never dare question a well-dressed gentleman traveling with premium first-class tickets. He turned their own societal etiquette into his primary cloaking device. In stark contrast, look at the psychology of the train guards. They operated under a collective illusion of safety. Because no British Express train had ever been breached in motion, their behavioral routine was completely passive. They didn't watch the doors, they watched the clock. The outlaws exploited this psychological complacency, counting on the fact that a human mind trapped in a repetitive, unmonitored routine takes up to 2 full minutes to process a sudden, high-stakes threat. But here is where we must bridge this historical mindset directly to our modern world. In 1876, Bill McCarty needed physical duplicate keys, iron footplates, and a moving baggage van to infiltrate the British Empire's supply lines. Today, in 2026, modern criminal syndicates use the exact same psychological blueprint to compromise global infrastructure. They don't jump on moving trains. They execute digital supply chain cyber attacks. They identify a trusted third-party vendor, a software supplier, a logistics manager, or an administrative portal, and compromise their digital keys. By disguising their malicious code as a verified premium system update, they ride completely unnoticed straight into the secure vaults of modern banks, shipping conglomerates, and energy grids. The physical environment has completely transformed from steel rails to digital fiber optic cables, but the predator's psychological exploitation of systemic trust remains identical. The historical trial of the 1876 train robbers never took place inside a British courtroom. By the time the task force managed to trace the duplicate key mold back to the London foundry, Bill McCarty and Harry Williams had already boarded a steamship under false names, vanishing into the crowded streets of New York City. The gold bullion was never recovered. It was melted down inside an illicit underground refinery in Manhattan, its distinct imperial stamps completely erased, converted into untraceable American currency within weeks. The outlaws had successfully outrun the physical reach of the British Empire. The cultural and legal legacy of the Great Train Robbery of 1876 forced a sweeping, permanent overhaul of transportation security across Europe. It marked the definitive end of the trust era for public infrastructure. The railway companies completely discontinued external carriage footplates, standardized enclosed passenger corridors, and mandated the installation of real-time emergency telegraph links on every express line. But the ultimate goal of examining this historical failure through the forensic mirror is to ensure we do not make the same mistakes in our current digital era. True crime cannot just be a passive history lesson or casual entertainment. It must serve as an active, functional alarm system. We must look at our current industrial networks, our modern cybersecurity protocols, and our own digital behaviors, and force ourselves to answer the most uncomfortable question of all. Where are we relying on unverified trust right now that a modern predator is actively targeting? If Bill McCarty were alive today, he wouldn't be holding a Colt revolver in a dark forest. He would be sitting behind a screen, exploiting our collective complacency to erase millions with a single keystroke. For our pinned comment discussion today, Given that the 1876 outlaws escaped entirely due to a total lack of communication between moving trains and land stations, what do you think is the modern world's most dangerous infrastructure blind spot today? Is it our electrical grids, our automated shipping ports, or our reliance on centralized cloud servers? Let's map out the modern structural flaws below. The past leaves a heavy trail, but our collective analytical awareness is the only shield capable of stopping history from repeating itself in the shadows.